Okay.
Yeah.
So the people enter the webinar.
Great.
Welcome.
Sorry.
Just do a quick introduction. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator. And tonight we're hosting the launch for The Fire in His Wake by Spencer Wolff. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on your screen through the event, and Spencer will take them at the end. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and it's also reposted in the chat. Spencer will be in conversation with Nyuol with Tong, and I'll introduce Nyuol and Spencer now. Nyuol Lueth Tong is a writer from South Sudan and editor-in-chief of the Bare Life Review, a journal of immigrant and refugee literature. Tong is the editor of the first ever anthology of short fiction from South Sudan, There's a Country. His work has appeared in McSweeney's, The Baffler, and NPR, among other publications. He is a PhD student of comparative literature at Yale University. Spencer Wolff is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and journalist based in Paris, France. His work focuses primarily on diaspora, migration, and racial justice, and has previously appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, and Time, among others. In 2009, he worked at the UN Refugee Bureau in Rabat, Morocco, and The Fire in His Wake is his first novel. And you can take it away.
Great. So I guess we're going to start with an excerpt from the novel, The Fire in His Wake. It'll be about a 10-minute reading, and then we'll proceed to conversation, and we will take your questions and discuss them afterwards. Okay, so this is chapter 7 of The Fire in His Wake. Simon skipped up the stairs, a thick pink folder rolled hard against his thigh. His very first resettlement interview, and it was a credible case for submission. What were the odds? He paused on the landing and smoothed his hands over the rumpled sides of his blazer. He had carried himself well, he thought. He had dressed smart, exuded authority. Sure, he had scraped his chair a bit excitedly across the floor, twice, maybe 3 times, but he had been adept, in control. Had he fidgeted? He didn't think so. In any case, the PRA had no way of knowing it was his first unassisted interview. What a rush. He reached the top of the stairs and proceeded down a glittering white hall, his tasseled brown loafers skating over the smooth, tiled floors. Odd that the refugee was his same age, down to the day. Of course, you can never really be sure with them. The birthdays they gave were often fanciful. It could be a name day or a national holiday or some arbitrary date plucked out of thin air, which had special meaning for them or no meaning whatsoever. Could they really be the same age? He paused in front of a reflective brass plate mounted beside one of the office doors. His face stared back at him, polished in liquid gold. Long, thick locks of dirty blonde hair tumbled over a high golden forehead, gold blue eyes flecked with chips of flaxen brown, a gilded aquiline nose with a small golden knob on the bridge. Not a mark or blemish on his baby smooth golden skin. Promising features, he thought. Dynamic, commanding, executive. The man he had just interviewed was of a different sort. His chocolate brown skin pockmarked with fever blisters. The wide bridge of his nose puffed awry with the signs of several bashings. His eyes 2 liquid sinks, wed with pink veins. His cheeks hollowed by malnutrition. And that scar, like a serpent wriggling through grass. Could he really be 28 years old? His forehead seemed furrowed with misery. Perhaps that explained the subject's noncompliance during the interview. Simon had looked a tad young to his eyes. Despite the sober suit, despite the stranglehold tie that he wrenched open as he burst onto the bright white terrace on the 2nd floor of the UNHCR. But he had presided over that stifling room, an unflinching rod of authority, while dribbles of sweat trickled his spine. And resettlement. He had already begun drafting the RF in his head. What were the elements of the claim? Lack of local integration, victim of torture or violence, urgent medical condition with no access to adequate treatment? Was there any exclusion criteria? Record of combat, criminal activity, special needs assessment? He would have to review the resettlement handbook. Where would he apply first? Sweden? That was the low-hanging fruit. Or maybe France. The PRA was a French speaker. He would integrate better there. The French, though, were finicky. They looked for any excuse to reject an RRF. But this one was sound. Certainly there are inconsistencies in the account, minor ones. It was always like that. He had sat in on nearly a dozen interviews and the subjects were constantly tripping over themselves. Most of the time, their stories defied good sense, not to mention the laws of continuity. It was exasperating. They jumped from one event to another without obvious causal connection, like in some art house film. But the UNHCR guidelines encourage a principle of benefit of the doubt, so long as the applicant's claims were coherent and plausible. And coherent and plausible were entirely different dress in Africa. But this one was different. He had pushed back, turned aside the current of the interview. What a dramatic tale, like something out of Shakespeare, or older, less plotted, more disjointed. The Odyssey, perhaps. Africa with its fetishes and fallen kingdoms, der Mensch tragt und Gott lacht, as his grandfather used to say. If he hadn't lived in Rwanda, hadn't seen those cartloads of carved talismans coming over from the Congo, those rows of twice-faced forest idols and waist-high masks, demented laughing charms and Nkizi nail totems, all bred out of that endless bush as if the jungle were the foundry of dreams. Well, it all belonged to another world. He stopped suddenly, shielding his eyes, blinking furiously as pulses of light crashed against his retinas like waves on the shore. Slowly, the second floor terrace dimmed into view. The roar of a crowd filled his ears, and the empty whack and skid of a polyurethane ball against shorn grass. Baptiste, a UN officer from Yaoundé, was camped in front of an open laptop. The computer sat on a Victorian-style table of wrought iron, painted in antique white. Above it spread the twisting branches of an olive tree, bathing Baptiste in a fluctuating web of shadow and light. A handsome man with coppery brown skin and trim, neat features. Per usual, he was dressed more for the nightclub than the office. Today, it was a tailored three-piece suit, a white cutaway shirt, and a black pencil tie. Baptiste held his face fanatically close to the screen, his brow creased with a heroic concentration normally reserved for a duel. "You're watching soccer?" Simon asked as he stepped towards the table. Baptiste glanced up. "This isn't soccer, mon ami. This is poetry with a ball. This is ballet on grass. I am watching the Africa Cup, and once again the indomitable lions are devouring their opponents." His large, bright eyes twinkled mischievously, and an infectious Cheshire smile extended far beyond the corners of his mouth. When he leaned back in the chair, Simon noticed a surprisingly gaudy green and gold handkerchief with the roaring snout of a lion poking above the edge of his breast pocket. "Who are they playing?" "They are up against the Black Stars, but I'm afraid the Ghanaians have eaten too much fufu again. They're waddling around the pitch like pregnant women. And look at Essien. It's embarrassing that the Lions are only ahead by 1 goal when Ghana's best player is a pigeon-toed gorilla who keeps tripping over the ball." Baptiste slapped the table and took a hurried sip from a can of cherry cola, one eye still on the screen. "So much for African solidarity," Simon remarked with a grin. "If you spent less time planning weekends in Ibiza and more time reading African history, you would know that we are not a continent renowned for its abiding solidarity," Baptiste replied, and then inched even closer to the laptop screen. Simon's jaw dropped. "That was 2 weeks ago," he protested, "and I spent most of the time on the beach reading King Leopold's Ghost." "A perfect place to ponder a century of enslavement, expropriation, and mass murder," Baptiste added with a half smile. Simon felt his cheeks burn. "But if you excuse me, I'm occupied with another massacre. The Ghanaians will be weeping and tearing their hair after this game. It is a national tragedy." "I just finished my first resettlement interview," Simon announced. Baptiste sighed and lowered the sound on the computer. So today was your baptism by fire. How did it go?" He leaned back in his chair and regarded the young JPO for the first time. Simon smoothed back his mane of blonde hair and leaned towards the Cameroonian officer. I think we have a solid case for resettlement. So he bamboozled you, Baptiste responded without missing a beat. We'll pause there. I think it's a good moment to end. No, your sound is off. Hold on, we're dealing with technical difficulties.
Yeah, okay.
There we go.
Oh, so are we going to stop there, Spencer?
Yeah, I like that moment. So he bamboozled you, kind of makes you wonder what's going to come next.
Yeah. So are you going to continue reading, or are you start?
No. That's it.
Okay.
That's the excerpt.
Yeah, I really like this chapter. In a way, it encapsulates a lot of the themes that the novel explores. A mixture of cynicism, but also, differences of culture and attitudes. Before we get into the formal and thematic aspects of the book, I think it would be good for the audience to learn more about the origin and the context of the book. How did you come to write this book?
Yeah, so great. So as Chris from Powerhouse, mentioned in my bio, in 2009, I was on mission to the UNHCR in Rabat, in the capital of Morocco. And it was a pretty dramatic summer. Just to give some of the context, or a pretty dramatic time that I spent there. To give some of the context, in 2009, this was obviously long before the collapse of Libya and Benghazi. And so Morocco was the main kind of transfer country or country of passage in Northern Africa. So there were a lot of people coming through trying to make it to the promised land of Europe from various places in Central, West, and Eastern Africa, and then even from, other parts of the world, from the Middle East and so forth. But the main populations of at least recognized refugees, people that the UNHCR had, created a dossier for taking an asylum interview with, were from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, and from the Ivory Coast. I also, at the time, was living in Rabat with a friend from the Congo, from the DRC, and two other French interns at the UNHCR. In and of itself, it was a fascinating experience and probably enough to write a novel from. But my mission there ended with a kind of massive demonstration by the refugee community in Morocco, demanding resettlement to Europe, on the basis that local integration in Morocco was impossible for in some sub-Saharan Africans because of their skin color. There's a lot of racism in Morocco, as I found about firsthand when the landlord tried to, for instance, chase my roommate out of the building because they didn't want to see Africans, for instance. The demonstrations were very intense. They lasted for 2 weeks, and the Rabati police and the Moroccan army kind of came by and cleaned everybody out in a dramatic fashion. And a few days later, a large group of refugees actually attacked the building while we were all inside. And we kind of ran for our lives, and, a day of tragedy ensued. This was a very tense situation. It was a very eye-opening situation because it really brought to the fore a lot of the structural problems with refuge or asylum in Morocco for certain populations, kind of other structural problems with the UNHCR system and how we came to a place where this could happen. And it seemed the stuff of, not the stuff of fiction in the sense that it was fictional, but of the stuff of a dramatic telling, kind of the source of a dramatic telling, and something that I felt impelled to tell because this massive debacle was not even covered in the media. It kind of, faded from sight immediately, and there was no moment of kind of observation, analysis, and, you know, what one might hope, reconciliation. At the time, there was just, you know, the crisis passed, and then it was business as usual afterwards.
Yeah, you explore these events too in the book, and now I'm hesitant to say the novel because the context just provided, and I think that's a formal thing that I think could open the discussion to even more specific things in the text. So it's obviously based on real events, and I hazard arresting somebody you knew or one of your roommates or somebody you interviewed, and Simon is you in some fashion.
In some ways.
Yeah. So and that choice is interesting, right? So it's grounded in real events and which are also immediate because 2009 is not that long ago. So the choice, your election to call this a novel is interesting. So I'm really curious, and as I'm sure other readers are, why did you sort of like describe this as a novel when in fact the events explored, you know, the characters evoked are somewhat real people that you encountered in Morocco?
Yeah, but, you know, like so many novels. I mean, you know, and many great novels, and, you know, I hope this will be well received. But some of the most, you know, the classics. I mean, and everything from Buddenbrooks to War and Peace to almost every French novel ever written are based in some ways on real events and real people, and then, you know, that forms a kind of groundwork for building a world, for creating a world and imagining around it. So yeah, in some ways, you know, there's two protagonists in the novel, just to let people know who haven't read it yet or received it. And, you know, one is Aras, whose name was both inspired by actually my roommate at the time had a hip hop group, and his stage name when he rapped was Ares, but, you know, this is Ares. I mean, this is the god of war, so it seemed a fitting name for the protagonist who flees a sort of wartime situation. And in some ways, his actual story is a true one. I mean, it's based on the past files that I encountered, past dossier I encountered in the UNHCR. But, you know, those files are so incredibly sparse. I mean, they're just the skeleton of a life where, you know, the power of fiction is not only to show a life, but to enact it. I mean, so that you know, the reader and the public and the writer himself, you kind of live this life with this person. And, you know, so that's one of the first reasons why this is a novel, because so much is imagined, and also because you travel with the characters and you follow their experiences. You know, this is not a kind of an omniscient bird's eye view or a historical work where I carry out sociological or political or structural analysis of the problems. I mean, it's just characters living in a world that that is potentially explosive at all times, maybe unbeknownst to them, and then obviously it explodes.
Yeah, I asked this question because it has some formal implications, but also given the climate right now and migrant refugee crisis being a thing, but also there's a question of cultural difference and difference of worldviews and epistemologies, if you will, and the question of cultural appropriation, or who gets to tell whose story, and by what right, you know, can Simon, you know, a white dude, a blonde white dude, tell the story of refugee befriended? And while it is a novel, I think that sort of gesture, I think, for some people can be problematic. And so there's an ethical concern there. And that's why I'm asking, to what extent does novel or fiction enjoy this sort of capacity to explore other lives and imagine them, or fill in the skeletons, as it were, of the dossiers that you received? So I think I want to dig in deeper about that question, because I'm sure you'll be asked again and again. And we talked about this also frequently, but I think it's something that readers are curious about. And I think the book, for readers who are more obsessed with these sort of questions of identity and appropriation and cultural appropriation and question of power dynamic and things like that, I don't want this question to sort of like distract or detract from the work, which is really powerful, and it does amazing things. Even if you have to call it a memoir, it will still do good work in terms of evoking these lives and bringing to attention real issues that people are facing. Yeah, but still, formally and culturally, it still remains a question of who gets to tell whose story.
Yeah, and it's such a fascinating, it's a recurring question. It's a very important question. It's one I consider myself, and maybe that actually brings us back to the genesis of the book once again, because working at the UNHCR, one of the power dynamics that you experience there is that, in a strange way, you're endowed with the authority to not only tell the stories of the people that you're interviewing, the asylum demanders who come and see you, who give you kind of sparse details, and you actually have to fill that in, and you're called upon to tell whether they're telling the truth or they're lying, and this decides their fate. These people who are actually from very different cultures and very different backgrounds, people who, in my case, were, I hope I'm a sensitive individual, but, who knew nothing about the places where many of the people I was interviewing came from. And then, their lives, as opposed to being imagined with empathy, as opposed to being kind of researched, in a gesture of human solidarity and trying to find common ground and common ideas and this kind of shared humanism or humanistic values. They're simply processed, and we were kind of called upon to pull out elements of their stories because it fit the elements of a claim, decide whether they're going to fit into the box of refugee or non-refugee, which was not a very nuanced box. And this is partially what created this calamity at the end. I mean, all these people being processed and not imagined, the power dynamics behind it, the sort of, callousness and jadedness that can befall many UN workers who are in some ways denied a relationship with the people that they're interviewing and, in a sense, filing, because this is just a job and they're processing people. And so it's from when I began writing this novel, which I began writing in 2009, so this has been an 11-year project, many things have changed in our cultural sensibilities around cultural appropriation, because this was actually the gesture and the impulse to imagine, to find common ground, to seek human solidarity through literature, to seek imaginative togetherness through literature was a kind of visceral reaction against my distaste for constantly processing people and my artificial authority over people that I truly had no right or grounds to have authority over. It came from that sensibility, but then there's so many other things we can talk about.
Yeah, but also the book also does that well, because like my first reading of it, even in the manuscript draft, it's a story of coming of age, and often, like, in a way, Simon is also figuring things out, and so is Erase, and so is everybody. And I think so in that sense, it's kind of an adventure story, which you said before too. So, for example, the critique of cultural appropriation confers upon Simon a certain power that might be external to Simon, because Simon in the text is really figuring things out as he's learning, he's encountering these things the same way that Erase is. So in a lot of ways, the novel does that. It does present, it's polyphonic, the chapters alternate between Simon and Erase, so both enjoy equal space in the book. And I think one of the powerful aspects of this book is their differences and all their similarities, and how they are trying to negotiate how they can relate or not relate. And I think it's really successful in that sense. It's very moving. So, and you mentioned this also prior, that it is really an adventure story, a coming of age story.
Yeah.
Just two young men coming to terms with this complicated world, and also in a very sort of a crucible, really, robot in this sense, a crucible, or a site of clashes of cultures and values, but also of priorities, and also of faiths. So I think I want to talk maybe about that, even the kind of the alternating that happened between chapters. Like, why did you pick that, and why couldn't you just use Simon, or can't you even write this in a first narration and more direct and even immediate sense?
Well, I mean, specifically for the reasons that you just outlined, that having these two worlds sort of collide but never truly meet and kind of pass by each other. And there are many scenes where the two of them, possibly inhabit the same geographical space, but they never see each other, as a metaphor for also these two worlds that that should meet in a sense, that should empathize with each other, but that culminate in a clash because they don't understand each other for reasons of lack of imagination, in a sense, an incapacity to imagine themselves in each other's shoes. I mean, the failure of imagination is much more on the part of the UNHCR workers, I would say, on the UN side than on the side of Ares and his friends and the the refugee community there. But it's only by kind of having the full background of these two individuals and sending them off into the world and realizing, because of the alternation, how similar they are in many ways, in the sense that they are in this classic category of young men out to discover the world who have left home for various reasons. In Ares's case, it's a very tragic reason. In Simon's case, you realize that he has gone off searching for something too. He has the privilege of choice in this case, but again, they're two young men figuring things out. And, something we talked about before about the nature of young men who are either actual refugees where they cannot return home or migrants and going off. Oftentimes, even though they're forced by circumstances to leave, this is an adventure for them. I mean, this is their chance to travel and discover the world and see what's out there and come of age and grow into their own skins and so forth. And I wanted that to be very present in the novel, which is, partially why it has such a kind of exciting cover in a sense, where you see all these scenes and, even if the scenes can be very intense, it's very much a Homeric journey for Ares, and he has to overcome certain obstacles and he has to come of age.
And he also seems to have a sense of his own story, even the opening chapters, and how the structures of the UN, or rather the institution that Simon works at, kind of limits the possibility of Ares being able to tell his story the way he imagines it, right? The way he recalls it. And there is that, which I really found fascinating. And he also talked about, refugees, as there are recognized refugees among whom Ares is one, and there are also refugees who are not. And I think sometimes a simplistic reading of a refugee just as a monolithic thing could be problematic, right? So I think it might be actually good if you would say a few words about that distinction between a refugee and the rest of the people.
And the rest of the people. And this, I totally want to fall into that, but it made me think of, how much these questions of cultural appropriation, the authority to tell tales have to be nuanced and complexified and so forth, because these categories are not monolithic in a sense. I mean, who can tell what tale, maybe Simon shouldn't tell Ares's tale, but should one of the people who murders Ares's family, even though they come from the same place and the same culture. I mean, that power dynamic is there. And conversely, if, in all these kind of complex categories, if we can't somehow imagine the people that we work with and live with and, our neighbors and our friends and what have you, due to a difference of provenance or pigmentation, then we're truly lost in a sense. Then society becomes impossible. And again, human solidarity becomes impossible. So I resist these categories or this sort of, this sort of idea of authority to tell a tale, and perhaps, I'd prefer something like, the onus to tell a tale responsibly, in a sense, that it'd be complex and it'd be well researched and well thought out. And so, we can talk about this if we want, and we can come back to the American Dirt controversy.
It's also a question of, on the one hand, it's an important question because of disparity of power, right? And
totally.
Like, for example, if a Reyes were to tell this story, he might not have been as lucky as you to publish a novel, right? So there is an objective structural disparity, and that means authority. But also, I think my interest is really mostly technical and formal or literary. So it's really a question of verisimilitude and who's formally effective to tell someone else's story. And I think that's where I'm interested more than a question of positionality or like somebody with authority by virtue of their privilege. It's more like, and you do a good job here, like, this is convincing. You do exactly what you just say. But the question will always linger there. And I think it requires often coming to kind of really reducing it to a question of form. And that's why I keep asking, because it's really interesting. And it's kind of the answer itself. The book is the answer to this concern of appropriation, but it's still a formal question. And you haven't been, I don't know, have you been to the Congo? And there's a way the culture speaks to the language, the saying. There's a lot of work here that offer the text a sense of credibility. And that Reyes is actually an fully imagined person, and his concerns are real, not simply a cipher through which, say, Simon is trying, or you're trying to kind of exploit this big mega problem. So for me, it's really a question of technique and its effectiveness.
Yeah, and this is why the last time we talked about Zadie Smith's, in article in Defense of Fiction and so forth, and how you can imagine these worlds that are different than you. In my case, I'm very lucky in this situation because I'm simply describing in almost 90% of the novel, my roommates, my friends, and so forth, people I live with and I'm still in contact with, and I spent great time with. So that's where the verisimilitude of the novel probably comes from, because it's all based on real characters. So in that sense, memoir is in some ways not inapt. But sorry, I still haven't answered your question about refugees versus asylum demand versus so-called economic migrants, which is a category that I also resist greatly and I find pretty awful. But the UN definition of a refugee is simply someone who, due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on religion, gender, race, ethnicity, and politics in some cases, but not others, is unable to return to their home country or to their country of origin, which also gets complicated. And everybody else that, is in danger, for instance, maybe let's even imagine an Italian who's being searched by the mafia, they're not considered persecuted. So even though they have to run for their lives because they didn't want to pay protection money, or, a kid fleeing a Nigerian gang, or anybody fleeing famine or poverty doesn't count as a refugee, even though, the consequences of remaining are the same, which is death. So what happens is that you create at least in the UN system, and to so many reasons, to limited resources and historical factors. Some people are recognized as refugees and not others. UNHCR Morocco, I should say something about it, is in a very peculiar position, because the UNHCR, the convention that the kind of the 67 protocol to the 51 refugee convention was never really ratified by Morocco. So the UNHCR is actually simply tolerated in Morocco, but they're not established in a certain sense like they are in European or Western countries. So there's a lot of pressure on the UNHCR to recognize as few refugees as possible. And there's an extreme racial divide, whereas North African refugees from the Maghreb who are white Arab, let's say, are given working rights and residency cards, and anyone who is not, especially sub-Saharan Africans, are given this kind of refugee card that they're often deported with, which makes the job, which makes both the job very intense and also the lives of the refugees there. And this is how we got to this these demonstrations.
That's like, I mean, in Egypt is similar too. I'm quite familiar with the experience being one myself, but but it's I think often the host country and its cultures and priorities, or even perception of others, often influence even the work of the UN and the welfare of the refugees, and it's quite difficult because I think camps are different than, say, living in an integrated society. So even fights over work in Egypt, for instance, is a big thing where they're always targeting refugees for taking their jobs, which is not true. So all these things are really problems that the book does well. It's also a very funny book in some regards, and it has this kind of it's not cynical, but it's this irony. Like even like where you stop when is it Baptiste say like you've been bamboozled, right? It's like there's this sort of like understanding of the system, and also because often the questions you ask a refugee, after a while you become aware of how to present your narrative. So you have people make up stories to suit the rubric of the UN, right? And that's where it becomes this kind of game of narratives, really. And that is also, I think the book does it in a good way and convincingly.
Yeah, and what Eretz tries to do in that opening chapter, I mean, the opening chapter happens about two-thirds into the book, and he's sick of this cat and mouse game, and he tries to gain control of the narrative and to pull back in a sense his humanity. And I like that the book opens with that for a reason, not just because you get a sense of the story of RS, but also you see that moment where he tries to pierce the bureaucracy.
And it's this dialectic, like they're talking past each other.
Yeah,
and I like that. It's like, I think it's actually, I thought it was like it read even like a play. Like they're saying a lot without saying it. Like I'm sure Simon, of course, understands, but he has to do his thing.
Right.
And he has to ask questions a certain way. The rest want to tell his story, and he understands the questions, but he needs to find his way. And that I think is so symptomatic of what actually goes on there, and it's also of the rest of the book. To be honest, there are these points of contact, but also of divergence. But they're also connected by the shared space, really. Say the office at the interview or the city or abroad. And I think that's really powerful. And I think it's one of the lasting impression I have of this book. I guess we have maybe 20 minutes. Would it be fine to bring in the guest questions or something?
Yeah, we don't have anything yet in the way of questions. But maybe the audience doesn't know that they can ask.
Maybe.
So
is Chris there to kind of moderate this? Oh, can you see the questions or?
I think I can. So either there are no questions and we've been perfectly clear and transparent, and we can keep talking a little bit, and we can talk about some of the technical matters, or we will we'll wait for some questions, basically. I just got a message. We have one person who wants to talk over audio.
That sounds good.
But I'm not sure how to respond to that. Sure, but
I mean, are you moderating?
I'm not. I got a question, maybe some more reading. Another text would be great.
I wasn't sure if it was you side view the whole time, but I like
getting a little background noise on your side.
Hold on.
Either two right in the corner. Yeah.
But I'm not necessarily sure that. Here we go. Okay, we have a question. Is the situation any different now with the refugees, or is it still the same in Morocco? That's actually a great question because I can answer it. Since I recently talked with some colleagues at the UNHCR in Morocco, and in some ways the situation has improved. but everyone keeps, so they keep telling me, yeah, it's, it's a lot better than it was 10 years ago, but no one has working rights. No one has residency cards. I'm not sure in which way it's improved. I mean, obviously the pressure is down, or was down, in Morocco due to Libya's collapse, because it was no longer the main transit country for going into Europe. So I think it made the police somewhat less ferocious with the migrant community or the refugee community in Morocco. There's some pretty intense, but also cynically ironic scenes in the novel that point to this. I mean, one thing I tried to keep up in the book was this kind of gallows humor, because it's something I encountered so often when I was meeting. I should actually say something about my past. So I did some asylum interviews and I did a lot of resettlement requests, but I was mainly in community services, which meant that the main, 80% of my job was actually visiting refugees in their homes, finding them jobs, when they were sick, bringing them to the hospital, and kind of going all over Rabat and seeing sometimes some pretty crazy scenes. And one thing that always struck me about people was their kind of capacity to make jokes, even during pretty horrible horrible events in a certain sense. But so what I think my UNHCR colleagues are basically saying to me when they're saying that the situation has improved, I think there's less deportations. There's probably less violence in general directed against the sub-Saharan community in Morocco. I think Moroccans are getting more used to having a somewhat more diverse country, in some ways, but the actual legal situation of the refugees is not better in any way, shape, or form. I mean, how do you live in a country if you can't legally work there and you don't have the legal right to stay? I mean, what is the worth of refugee status if it's worthless, so to speak? Say that you get some handouts from the UNHCR and some help with housing, and you get a nice guy like me to visit you from time to time and say, I know you need a job, I'm really sorry, I wish we could help you. I mean, I don't know how much that helped anybody. Here's another question. What is your impression of how UNHCR can train their employees to be more empathetic given the limitations of time allocated for interviews? Is that even possible given the capacity and resources available? Yeah, I mean, something I should say about even the characters represented in the novel is that there were some people at the UNHCR in Rabat that were incredibly dedicated, and that were also running themselves ragged, trying to crisis management and help people who truly cared about the refugees. And it was often people that surprised me later on, people that I thought were a little bit gruff with the refugees. I found out later just really cared about them and had certain friends among the community that they were very close to. Where does this callousness come from? I mean, sometimes the callousness comes from just years of doing this, and maybe instead of it being a passion, it slowly, morphs into just simply a job, and people become jaded and they start processing other individuals, and they can only absorb and tend to so much human suffering, even if their job is to kind of help people get back on their feet, which is a very noble work. And then, some of the structural blindnesses and that the novel talks about is that in the UN, you really have a certain, inequality of the executive officers who oftentimes are very well paid, and they live in nice housing outside of the city and become a little bit disconnected from the day-to-day lives of the refugees, versus the kind of lower level UN agents and employees who are on the ground, who are interacting day to day with the refugees, but who don't have the capacity to influence decision making at the top. And then it's just a question of international politics, and the novel talks about this too a lot. Countries just, you have these recognized refugees in Morocco, and they should be resettled, almost all of them, because almost none of them can locally integrate, and their lives are extremely difficult. But no country wants to take them, or the countries have quotas. Countries want a certain type of refugee. Oftentimes they want a young, able-bodied refugee who's going to come and work and pay taxes, but it's actually the former child soldier who has nightmares every night who really should be resettled in Sweden, because that's where he or she will get the psychological care that they need. So, there's structural problems, there's resource problems, there's just simple limits on human empathy, walls of empathy that people come across. And then maybe what the novel argues a bit is there's a problem of imagination, that, the idea being that literature, this extremely naive idea, but I have to endorse it as a writer, this kind of naive idea that literature can help us see other people better, and bring them into their worlds and make them familiar with us, and thereby, by kind of living beside them, by sharing this adventure with them, allow us to imagine them better, and therefore want to help them more. So, maybe documentaries, literature, and video could help the UNHCR, but yeah, I guess we'll see. Okay, this may be it for questions. There's about 10 minutes left. Nyuol, are you still on, or your screen is off? I'm kind of by myself at this point.
No, I'm here. There are more questions. There are more questions. Yeah.
There's a few more in the Q&A. We're getting tons of questions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's good.
I just received my copy. Looking forward to reading your book. Your conversation's been so interesting. Thank you, Chris. Oh, I don't really have a question, but I did want to say the actual physical beauty of the book's presentation is wonderful. Congratulations. I agree with you, Chris. That is very much thanks to McSweeney's and to a wonderful artist named Anuj. I believe it's Shrestha. I will put a link to his work up in the chat from this. We worked on this cover for a very long time. We went through an enormous number of variations and ideas between the McSweeney's team and Anuj and myself, trying to get this sense of adventure and a Homeric journey, and kind of stray away from this as a piece of historical fiction and put it more in the realm of literature. And I think it was really successful. Anonymous attendee, what's a message you would like to leave in the reader's spirit after reading the book? It's so I resist the idea of a message, because it's that kind of old phrase from Kafka that the journey is the goal. Der Weg ist das Ziel, which is this idea, what I was talking about before, that by living through this story, it becomes also your own. That the story becomes a journey that you yourself have undertaken, along with the author and the characters, and then this becomes part of your history and your experience, and thereby, you see the world in a different way, and whatever way that is, that's for each reader to decide. I of course hope the book brings these worlds together that so often pass each other in the book, that either collide or slide by each other. But as Elizabeth Bennet says in Pride and Prejudice, I cannot be the judge of my own performance. Here's a question from Jadri. Since this was an 11-year project, how did the writing process change over the course of that time? Has it become easier, harder, or different to revisit this time in your life or keep up with the current state of the UNHCR? The writing, so I think distance was very good for the book. I think it opened up imaginative possibilities. It also, over these 11 years, I became much more of a filmmaker, mainly making documentaries, but also doing fiction films and working on scripts. And that dramatically changed the structure of the novel because I became much more adept at kind of pacing cinema. And, in a visual medium, the public has a very, very short attention span. And so, at least I hope, again, in the structure of the book, there's a lot more twists and turns and cliffhangers and kind of suspense, and that I built that in over the 11 years. And I think that made it much more publishable and hopefully much more entertaining and engaging. Okay. And then still, this would love to hear more from the book. I don't think I'm the greatest reader. There is an audiobook which should be coming out in Audible soon, and it's up on Scribd, read by this amazing narrator, Elias Khalil, who grew up in Ghana but is of Lebanese background. And he hits all the characters perfectly, and he gets all the accents. And you actually, a couple of friends of mine were listening to it, and they thought there were multiple readers, which is generally a good sign. Yeah. Let's see what else. I think that's about it.
Yeah, that's about it for the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess we can kind of wrap it up maybe, and unless you want to read the rest of the chapter, or
it's a long chapter actually, so he bamboozled you. Let me see how much.
Yeah, I think you can stop where I don't mean to be too insistent, but
actually, I did not respond to some questions from Katya. We're going to see this on the screen as in a movie. Are there any programs for refugees to help them find jobs or places to live? There are, but the resources are so limited that, and because they're not recognized by the Moroccan state, they're simply, I wouldn't call them ineffective because they really do things and they help people, but they're not sufficient, which is part of why, a lot of the characters in the book you'll see are living in pretty dire circumstances, despite being recognized by the UNHCR and, receiving even financial aid. Yeah, I guess I could read a little bit more. So he bamboozled you. Let's see. Okay, you're gonna get some French though, without too much translation. Yeah, I'll read a couple more pages, and we'll see who wants to stay around for that and who wants to move on. For those who don't want to hear any more reading, thank you for attending and listening to me, and I hope you enjoy the book. And here we go with Simon saying, I think we have a solid case for resettlement, and Baptiste responding, so he bamboozled you. What do you mean? The color leached out of Simon's face. I felt that way too after my first few interviews, then reality settled in. A riotous shouting shocked out of the computer. Off the post, Baptiste howled. That's the third time. I think the Ghanaians have cast a spell on the ball. I'm no novice, Simon said when the din died down. I've already sat through several interviews with you and Hilda. Most of them are a mess, but this one was coherent, and the refugee suffers from an urgent medical condition. They swap stories in the refugee community, Baptiste replied, still shaking his head at the computer. That's why so many of their accounts resemble one another. I'm not saying they haven't undergone terrible experiences, but when you've heard the same general biography with a few details tweaked here or there from dozens of applicants, you grow a bit cynical. Then you start to probe, and suddenly none of it adds up. Sit down. Simon slapped the pink dossier onto the table, spun a chair around, and sat akimbo, his arms folded over the ridge of the back. Well, I've never heard a story like this one before. Baptiste raised his eyebrows. Where is he from? The DRC. Minority population? Banyamulenge? Of course, Simon replied. Let me guess. He saw his family killed before his very eyes. How did you know? Typical. You don't think it happened? Well, how did he escape? If everyone in his family was killed, then why is he alive? There's only two ways. One is that he took part in the killing to save his own skin. That's not uncommon. They force one of the victims to murder the others, but that means he falls into an exclusion category. Or let me guess, he didn't know how he was saved. The latter, Simon answered grudgingly. What happened? He was knocked unconscious and was carried to safety by an unknown individual about whom he has sparse details, if any. Simon nodded. He could feel the heat rise up the back of his neck. I've heard this one before. Yes, but it was the rest of what he told me, Simon insisted. It was spontaneous, credible, and like nothing I've ever heard. It sounds like he filled your head with some tall tales. Là où tu n'es pas arrivé, les nuages sont tombés. What do you mean by that? Did he request resettlement? Yes. And he has some rare, incurable medical condition that needs to be treated elsewhere. And he has some rare medical condition that needs to be treated elsewhere that is incurable in Morocco. The complications with his foot and ankles sounded acute. Did you inspect it yourself? Have you consulted with Dr. Digeri or pals to see if they're monitoring his case and what the prognosis is? Simon looked down at his shoes and didn't respond. Don't be glum. Exuberant cheers filled the terrace. This is the radio announcer. Nkong a tiré un bout magnifique, magnifique. Baptiste started clapping and pounding the table. That's it, he cried. As if summoned by the commotion, a moon-faced woman in a dark green smock issued from a half-occluded entrance on the far side of the terrace. She wore a grass-colored kerchief wound about her head and carried a silver tray topped with steaming glasses of Moroccan mint tea and pasty white almond garibas. She placed the tray down on the table before the two men and dramatically shivered in the cool February air. Would you like some tea to warm you? Sana, Simon said with a grateful smile. Once again, you've rescued me from near death. It's a cold day, she replied. I thought the tea would help. I think actually I'm going to stop there because then we get into Baptiste's nightlife and it doesn't tie in. Yeah.
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, so is Chris coming back or?
No. I think, he is. There we go. Hi, Chris.
Hey. So y'all, that's it. We can wrap it up.
Yeah. I got a very nice comment from James Osborne. Thank you. Where he just said great discussion and you sold the book. So thank you, James. And I guess that's it.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Spencer and Nyuol, and thank you to everybody who asked questions. If anybody missed any of the event, it'll be on YouTube soon. And please buy the book. We have the link on the event page in the chat, and helps us put on more events and support Spencer. He'll be signing book plates. So for any book that you purchase, thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers. Bye.